Have you ever imagined hearing someone in your family, maybe even your grandmother, make such an honest and unexpected confession that it makes you rethink your entire view of old age? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. It was an ordinary day, a casual conversation, and suddenly she blurted out such a raw truth about her intimate life that everything around me stopped. It was at that moment that I realized, there is an entire generation living in silence, carrying doubts, pain, and frustrations that no one has ever bothered to listen to. In this video, we will explore one of these stories, told by a grandmother who decided to break the silence and speak candidly about what happens to your sex life after 60. And more than that, we're going to show that yes, there is a way, there is a solution, there is pleasure and affection even after a certain age. But before we dive into this powerful and revealing story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and leave a like. This way, you'll help this content reach more people and, who knows, maybe change the life of someone who just needs someone to listen and a new perspective. Now, sit down, take a deep breath, and get ready to hear the kind of truth that no one has had the courage to tell until today. The conversation started off unpretentiously. We talked about family memories, old customs, what life was like in her day. But then, in a moment of silence, she uttered a phrase that echoed like thunder. It's been over 10 years since I've felt truly touched. There was no drama in her voice, but there was such deep, contained pain that I knew, in that moment, that there was something there that needed to be heard. She began to tell me about her marriage, about the routine that swallowed up gestures of affection, about the looks that no longer met, and about how sex had become something distant, almost forgotten. But what surprised me most was the way she spoke of her own guilt, as if it were wrong to still desire, to still dream, to still long for touch. It is this guilt that, according to her, most women her age carry. And this guilt stems from the idea that desire has an expiration date, that after a certain point, women should just settle. But why do we remain silent in the face of this? Why don't we make room for these voices to be heard? That's what this video seeks to do, give voice to a generation that still has so much to say, feel, and live. As she spoke, it was as if every word that came out of her mouth was a bridge being built between generations. There was a sincerity that touched me deeply, a pain that came not from the absence of sex itself, but from the feeling of being forgotten as a woman. She said that for a long time she thought she was being selfish for wanting more, for wanting to be looked at, touched, loved with intention. And that made me think about how many other women must be feeling the same way and keeping those feelings silent. The most moving part was when she said that, even with all this, she never stopped believing in the possibility of starting over. She said that there were days when she looked in the mirror and tried to remember what it was like to feel beautiful, desirable, alive. And little by little, she began to realize that pleasure, desire, and intimacy do not belong to a phase of life, but are part of who we are from beginning to end. This realization turned into small actions, choosing clothes she liked, taking care of her skin not out of vanity, but out of self-love, and even seeking knowledge about her own body, about the changes it had undergone, and how she could still feel pleasure, but in a different way, with different timing and intensity. It was in this process of rediscovery that she began to feel something that had long seemed dormant, self-esteem. Not superficial vanity, but that quiet confidence that comes from within. She told how she decided to buy new lingerie, even though no one would see it. It was for herself. How she began to walk more slowly, feeling her own body in motion, paying attention to gestures that were once automatic. She said she began to touch herself with more respect, not guilt. That she learned to explore new sensations, that she understood that pleasure doesn't have to be the same as before to be valid. And then I realized she wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about an entire generation of women who were taught to serve, to give in, to put the needs of others before their own. And that, as they grew older, they were left with empty hands and silence. But she chose to break that cycle. She chose to see herself as someone who still deserves pleasure, affection, and love. She told me that she started reading about mature sexuality, that she looked for a gynecologist who treated her with dignity, that she understood that her body can still be a source of pleasure, even if it now has a different rhythm. She also talked about how talking to other women her age was essential. When she started opening up, she realized she wasn't alone. That other friends felt the same way but didn't have the courage to say so. Many were afraid of looking ridiculous, others carried guilt for wanting something beyond their grandchildren, church, and the 8 o'clock soap opera. But there, amid confidences, shy laughter, and some deep silences, a safe space was born. A space where desire could exist without judgment. Where sensuality was not a memory, but a possibility. And at that moment, I understood, the climax of this story is not in a big dramatic twist. It is in small new beginnings. It's in a 70-year-old woman who decides she will no longer accept invisibility as her fate. It's in a gesture of quiet courage, like buying a book on female pleasure or making an appointment that has been postponed for years. It's in learning to breathe deeply and allow yourself to feel, without fear, without haste, without guilt. Because true transformation does not come from outside. It comes when we start listening to ourselves again. She told me that one of the most memorable moments of this rediscovery was when she bought a full-length mirror and put it in her bedroom. Something simple, but for her it symbolized reconciliation. She started looking at herself every day, not to find flaws, but to recognize that her body had a history, had value, had beauty. She began to notice the details, a spot here, a wrinkle there, the texture of her skin, the way her shoulders moved. She said that, for the first time in years, she didn't look at herself with haste or demand, but with curiosity and tenderness. And it was this gesture that rekindled a flame that had been hidden within her. Not a flame of crazy passion, but of presence. Of being with herself in the present. She said that the greatest discovery was understanding that pleasure no longer had to depend on someone else. That she could feel it alone, in other ways, with other meanings. And that wasn't loneliness. It was autonomy. It was freedom. It was the certainty that there was still so much to live, feel, and experience. When she finished telling us everything, we were silent. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was a silence full of presence, of understanding. A silence of someone who had shared something sacred. I realized that this woman I had always seen as a grandmother, strong, wise, and serene, was also a woman with desires, fears, memories, and wishes as human as mine. And that perhaps the biggest mistake society makes is precisely to dehumanize old age. To reduce mature people to secondary roles, when in fact they still have so much to teach and to live. The conversation with her was not just an outpouring. It was an awakening. It was the beginning of a new perspective that I have never been able to shake. I understood that sexuality after 60 not only exists, but deserves to be celebrated, discussed, and lived with freedom and dignity. And if this story touched you in any way, maybe it's time to make room for it too. To listen more. To ask questions. To talk. Because sometimes, all someone needs is a non-judgmental ear and a chance to start over. Before we go, subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and leave a like. This is the kind of content that needs to reach more people because it speaks with truth, humanity, and courage. Share it with those you love and who can relate to this story. Now, let's finish this journey with everything that still needs to be said. She told me that after that conversation, something inside her changed. Not that everything changed overnight, but her view of herself was never the same again. She began to walk with a lighter step, started attending conversation circles with other women her age, and even joined a therapy group focused on sexuality and maturity. She said she learned things that no one had ever taught her, that the body does change, but that doesn't make it any less capable of feeling. That desire may diminish, but it can also be cultivated. And that the greatest stimulus is not outside, but inside, in the way we see ourselves, treat ourselves, and allow ourselves to be. This freed her from a series of beliefs that had kept her silent. She said that it's never too late to start over, and that sometimes it all starts with a simple choice, listening to your heart. She told me that when she allowed herself to talk about it, other people began to open up as well. Daughters, sisters, friends. Women who had always been strong, but who deep down carried the same doubts, the same guilt, the same silences. And together, they created a space where they could talk about everything, pain, longing, the desire to start over, fears, and even fantasies. A space where there was no judgment, only listening. And there, in that place of true exchange, they began to heal. They began to laugh more, to walk with more confidence, to dress up for pleasure, to touch each other with affection. Because they understood that sexuality does not end, it just transforms. That touch can be more subtle, but also more profound. That a kiss can be longer, a look more sincere, and pleasure more complete. And this transformation does not have to be solitary. It can be collective. It can be shared with those who are also ready to live maturity to the fullest. She said that one of the greatest freedoms she felt was when she realized that she no longer had to follow any rules that she had not chosen for herself. That she could say yes, but she could also say no. That she could desire someone, but she could also choose to be alone. That the most important thing was to feel alive, whole, in control of her own story. And this was reflected in everything, in the way she dressed, the places she went, the books she read, the looks she exchanged. She said that one day she looked in the mirror and realized she was no longer ashamed of her body. She felt proud. Because that body told her story, resisted time, pain, loss, and was still there, pulsing. She looked at me with a smile and said, "I am no longer the woman I was, but I am more myself than ever." And in that moment, I understood everything. Sexuality, pleasure, intimacy, none of it is about age. It's about presence. It's about truth. At the end of that conversation with my grandmother, it became clear to me that it wasn't just about sex. It was about dignity, identity, affection, and autonomy. She showed me that even when the world tries to silence a generation, there is still a voice. There is still a pulse, desire, will. And the most beautiful thing is to realize that transformation happens when a person allows themselves to feel. When they realize that they no longer need to fit into any role that does not represent them. And if there is one thing this conversation has taught me, it is that every journey of reconnection begins the moment we choose to look within ourselves with honesty. That's why this story doesn't end here. In the next videos, we'll explore even more about the paths to an active, healthy, and respectful intimate life after 60. Subscribe now, comment here on what touched you most on this journey, and what you'd like to see in future content. Thank you for being here. See you next time.